Hey, it's Kevin Sharp. Today I'm joined by J.M. Dematteis, the writer of Spider-Man: The Lost Hunt, as well as numerous other classic comics runs.
Mark, thank you for joining us on Comic Art Live.
Pleasure to be here.
Now, you have chosen one of the iconic covers of the Marvel Age.
Well, it's the cover to Fantastic Four number 48, which is the beginning of the famous Galactus trilogy. Which is interesting, by the way. It's not really a trilogy because if you look at the books, half the first book is the end of the Inhuman story, and the Galactus story in Part Three ends about a half to two-thirds way through the story. They packed all that Galactus stuff really into about 2 issues worth of those 3 issues. Um, but it's a cover, when you see a cover before you read the comic, it's a whole different thing. So when I was in junior high school and I call it a religious conversion to Marvel Comics from DC, and my little brain exploded and I started, going to this local, there weren't even comic shop, this local used bookstore and buying back issues, spending like sometimes up to $3 on a comic book, which was outrageous. Um, and I saw an ad with the cover to Fantastic Four number 48 in it in one of those comics that I bought. And to me, the best covers are the covers that tell a story. I looked at that cover and I created a story in my head. It wasn't exactly the story that they told, but it was kind of similar because if you look at that cover, it's one of the quietest covers you'll ever see. But it's filled with dread. The Watcher is standing there. The Fantastic Four is standing there. There are all these people behind them standing like on rooftops and things, and the Watcher's just pointing off into the distance. We have no idea what he's pointing to. We don't know what's coming. But that image just filled my head with an entire story. And it stayed with me ever since. And in fact, I did an original series a few years back for IDW with Mike Cavallero called Impossible Incorporated. And I did my version of the story that I imagined in my head when I was a kid as part of Impossible Incorporated. Not the same story, obviously, but the same feeling that I got from that cover. So I love covers that will do that for you. That it's not. I'm not a poster cover. Once in a while is a cool thing. I think poster covers have taken over way too much. I like a cover that tells a story, and if it can tell a story that explodes your imagination, that you're imagining stories even beyond what's in the book, all the better. So that's it. Still remains probably my favorite comic book cover of all time for that reason.
So, when you would have found this, if you remember, where were you in your Marvel Comics journey at this point? Were you an
Very
FF?
early,
Okay.
very early, because like I said, I was probably in the seventh grade, and I had been like a DC guy most of my life. Well, that's not true. I read everything as a kid. When I was a kid, there were no comic shops. You went to the local candy store, and there was everything. There were superhero comics. There were funny animal comics. There were romance comics. There were war comics. There were comics based on TV shows. There were Bob Hope and Jerry Lewis comics. But in terms of the superhero world, I was reading DC, and I remember being a little bit younger and one day picking up a copy of Marvel Tales #1, which had reprints of the origin of Spider-Man and a few other characters, and Avengers #1. And I was just too young. The stuff was too weird for me. The colors were lurid. The characters looked monstrous. If you remember, the early Marvel covers had these big black borders around the balloons on the covers. It was like, it was just, I'm not ready for this. I like this nice, clean, pristine DC stuff. But by the time I was in junior high school, Marvel was really picking up a lot of momentum, and everyone in school started, these Marvel comics, these Marvel comics. I said, well, let me go check them out again. There was a big Catholic church across the street from my school, from my house, not from my school, from my apartment house. And I was sitting on the steps outside this church reading these comics. And it was the perfect place for a religious conversion. I've converted now from DC to Marvel, although I have to say I would sneak some DCs in along the way. But it wasn't till some years later when Kirby went to DC that I went, well, if Jack can go back to DC, so can I. But it was then through picking up some back issues that I came across that ad for the Galactus story, and it blew my mind. And of course, then when I finally read it, now we're so used to cosmic stories. There had never been anything like that in a comic book before. This just the concept of the Watchers, then this guy that consumes entire planets, and then the Human Torch takes his journey across infinity to find this ridiculous gun that scares Galactus. You know, it's like it's amazing. You know, you have to put these things in context of the times. It's like when people watch Star Trek, the original Star Trek, and go, "Oh, it was so cheap." No, it was one of the most expensive TV series ever done at the time. The effects may look cheap to us now, but they were cutting edge then. So when you put these stories and what Kirby and Lee were doing in context of the times, it's extraordinary. You know, they were just breaking barriers left and right and doing things that had not been done before.
Well, speaking of Kirby, as our viewers are seeing this cover as we speak, looking at it now with your professional eyes, what does it do for you?
You know, I think it was Stan that once said, no matter what Kirby did, even if it was a hand turning a doorknob, it was dynamic. There was always energy. So here's this cover that in someone else's hands could have been really quiet and really boring. It's just a bunch of people standing there looking at something that's coming. But everything, every expression, all the body language, the tone, the mood, everything is yes, it's filled with mystery. It's also filled with dread. There's a sense of dread hanging over the whole thing, and it's dynamic. Even just the watcher pointing his hand is dynamic because Kirby couldn't do anything that wasn't dynamic, that didn't have energy. You could feel the energy in the quietest scene. And, you know, if I've always said if anyone in the entire history of comics deserves to be called a genius, it was Jack Kirby, because he was. And the more time goes by, the more we see his genius. Every few years, I like to reread the New God stuff because those are probably my favorite mainstream comics of all time, and they get better with time, and that's the mark of genius. You know what I mean? Some of the other stuff from the '60s, you go back, you read it, feels a little dated, and the New God stuff just gets deeper and richer as time goes by.
I can't think of a better note to end on than praising the genius of Kirby. Thank you again for joining us on Comic Art Live.